Fraud crackdowns sweeping the country. A former powerful politician appeals his corruption conviction, and America's talking. This is the Center Square Daily for Friday, April 10th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. The result of a massive hospice fraud bust in Los Angeles County has been revealed, and California state officials taking the credit. Since 2020, nationwide, fraudsters have scammed at least $36 billion and as much as $3 trillion in tax money from federal entitlement programs. The team from the Center Square reviewing 2,500 documents and statements from the Department of Justice, press releases, and fact sheets, and found public safety net programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid lost billions of dollars to scams each year. The amount ranged from $2.7 billion in 2022 to $14.5 billion in 2025. Now, for months, a lot of focus has been on the daycare fraud within Minnesota, but the fraud goes beyond that to a particular state and that particular program. Thursday, California Attorney General Rob Bonta announced his office's efforts in fighting Medicaid fraud. And this comes after earlier in the month, the FBI made multiple arrests in Los Angeles County. Charges in the FBI sting included healthcare fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Now, Wednesday, by executing search warrants and arrest warrants at 10 locations, 5 suspects being arrested throughout Southern California in Operation Skip Trace. Here is California's Attorney General Rob Bonta.
Last Thursday, we filed felony criminal charges against 21 suspects, including healthcare fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. And yesterday, we successfully executed search and arrest warrants at 10 separate locations and arrested 5 suspects so far throughout Southern California.
Now, California officials say the bust comes after a tip from the California Department of Health Care Services of alleged hospice fraud at 14 companies. Those involved in the scheme would purchase personal identifying information for people who live outside of California. They would get that off of the deep web and then enroll into a California program, posing as California residents. Participants in the alleged fraud then bought hospice companies and began billing Medi-Cal for non-existent services for those stolen identities. Now, after revealing all of this, Bonta went on to take credit for the bust.
I just want to make one point very clear. This is just the latest example of the California DOJ's longstanding, ongoing, and successful efforts to combat hospice and Medi-Cal fraud. We have been doing this work for years. We've been doing it successfully before certain people in this country decided to think about it for the first time. We will continue to do this work. Heads down, sleeves rolled up, important investigative work, prosecutorial work. I also want to make clear, this is our case, a California case, from beginning to end.
Now, you've got the ongoing sunlight being put on the issue of fraud under the Trump administration, with a new organization being formed and Vice President J.D. Vance leading up those efforts. But in California, Assembly Minority Leader Heath Flora telling the Center Square that the latest out of California is an acknowledgement at both the state and federal levels that there is massive, organized criminal efforts to defraud California's social safety net programs that taxpayers are footing the bill for. Now, California, being among the country's largest states, their budget actually surpasses that of some countries. But every dollar stolen through fraud is a dollar that doesn't go to those who need it, and it's happening all around the country. A former Chicago area nonprofit executive has been sentenced to a year in federal prison for misappropriating nearly $1.9 million through a pair of fraud schemes. This coming on the information from federal prosecutors that the Center for Community Academic Success Partnerships schemed with another executive to defraud the Illinois Department of Education out of about $1.8 million. In Washington State, Seattle council members are calling for a formal audit of the city's Human Services Department there, but that review won't be getting immediate attention. That's because the auditor's office has a backlog. Last August, a damning King County, Washington audit showed that money was being spent at the County Department of Community and Human Services faster than anyone could track it. Between 2019 and 2024, the Department of Community and Human Services saw its grant awards double from $922 million to $1.87 billion. And much of this money came from the Best Starts for Kids tax levy, a decade-long promise to the region's youth funded by King County property owners. Michigan's Attorney General continuing to pursue fraud cases around that state, announcing charges against a Macomb County dentist in what prosecutors are saying is a massive Medicaid fraud scheme. The charges there stem from allegations that a dentist billed the taxpayer-funded Medicaid program for dental crowns that were unnecessary or that were never provided. The charges come as state lawmakers raise broader concerns about fraud errors and oversight across Michigan's public assistance system, which collectively serves millions of residents and account for billions in spending. And even Texas, Attorney General Ken Paxton filing a lawsuit against a group of dental providers and, quote, sham marketers for allegedly billing Medicaid patients and performing medically unnecessary procedures to defraud Texas Medicaid. And Medicaid fraud isn't the only rock to overturn. Federal prosecutors have charged 4 people in New York City with embezzling more than $1.3 million from a Brooklyn-based nonprofit that operates migrant shelters as part of a widening public corruption investigation. So there's much more to be said about the ongoing fraud accountability sweeping the country. From law enforcement officials tracking fraud to someone who was found guilty by a jury for corruption now appealing that conviction, let's talk with the Center Square's Illinois reporter Jim Talamonte about the latest in the saga around former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. Jim, thanks for taking time. Madigan was the longest-serving State House Speaker in State House history, from what I believe, from across the country. But his fall from grace a couple of years ago ultimately landed him in a prison cell last year. And now he wants out. You were in an appeals court yesterday in Chicago for that appeal that Madigan brought forward on being convicted of 10 corruption counts. What's this all boiling down to?
Well, it comes down to what is quid pro quo, something for something, an exchange. Is this part of the normal course of life in politics, or are we talking actual bribery? That was the crux of this case, a trial that went 4 months long, a little bit over 4 months, from October of 2024 to February of 2025. And it was in February of 2025 that a federal jury convicted Michael Madigan, who for about a quarter century was essentially the most powerful politician in the state of Illinois. And his tenure ended in 2021 amidst allegations. And those eventually led to federal charges and the trial, which resulted in Madigan then last June being sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, and where he is now serving at a federal facility in West Virginia. And he's also ordered to pay a $2.5 million fine, which was actually more than prosecutors had asked for. Well, Madigan's team has appealed that, and Madigan himself was not in court on Thursday, but his defense team was, with a new lead defense attorney. And so they appeared before the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in the same building, the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in Chicago, where Madigan was tried and convicted last year. And so this 3-judge panel heard arguments, first from the defense. And as was the case during the trial, there was a lot of criticism of the way the case was handled in federal court. There was criticism of the jury instructions, suggestions that the court erred. Michael Madigan had a high-powered defense team, and he added Amy Saharia to lead that team in the appeals process. And this wasn't a lengthy hearing, but there were a number of pointed questions from these judges, 2 in particular, at Madigan's defense attorney to talk about jury instructions. And the argument essentially from Madigan's team is that the instructions were vague. The counts were vague in terms of the charges related to ComEd and Madigan and bribery and allegations of fraud. And then also there were, according to Madigan's defense team, there wasn't actual quid pro quo. There wasn't something for something exchanged in relation to a state board seat. that was Madigan was allegedly going to provide in return for benefits. And so that was the argument from Madigan's team. Of course, prosecutors had a different view of things after those defense arguments. Only one of the 4 lead prosecutors from the trial was back for this hearing on Thursday. That was Julia Schwartz, assistant U.S. attorney. But she certainly echoed some of her colleagues and her own arguments in the initial trial. And her, main line was, not only was this bribery, this was quintessential bribery. And that was the line she provided. There were some questions for her as well, but it seemed the judge's questioning was a little more pointed at the defense. And so the judges agreed to take this case under advisement. We don't know how long they may take to make a decision. But in the meantime, Michael Madigan sits in a federal facility in West Virginia after, again, he spent years really controlling not only the Illinois legislature, but a lot of Chicago politics as well. And
well, not just Chicago politics, Jim, state politics. He was chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, controlling the party purse at the same time saying, hey, legislator, you want to keep your job? You vote for this piece of legislation, and I'll ensure that you get Democrat Party dollars to run your race in a year and a half. So you could see that nexus of power that Madigan had for decades in the state of Illinois, and why there was so much criticism from Republicans saying that Madigan was the Velvet Hammer was one term that was used to describe his power that he had. But clearly what he was convicted of in the ComEd saga. All this being revealed in late 2020, and back then even Republicans saying we need ethics reforms, and then they had their own Illinois House investigation into it, which was chopped off really quick by now current Speaker of the House, Chris Welch, who was just a state representative back in late 2020, but he chaired this special investigating committee that was required once Republicans requested it. Nothing came out of that House-led investigation. It was only after Madigan was replaced by Welch and then stepped down from office and from the DPI, the Democrat Party of Illinois. That's when the feds went ahead and charged him. So to that, all to say, have we seen any true substantive ethics reforms at the Illinois State House in Springfield?
Well, Greg, that depends on who you ask. If you ask Speaker Welch, who replaced Madigan, if you ask Governor J.B. Pritzker, they'll tell you, yes, we passed meaningful ethics reform in the wake of this. This made a big difference. But good government groups, Reform for Illinois, and of course, State House Republicans, well, they're not buying it. And they say the little bit of legislation that was passed in Springfield at the Capitol was watered down and was not effective. So each year we have seen State House Republicans, and actually occasionally some Democrats have proposed ethics moves as well, more geared toward utilities than geared toward their own caucus. But Republicans have proposed bill after bill, year after year. They've called this out in press conferences. We've seen Reform for Illinois and others call for change, call for reform. But the governor, and he's been asked repeatedly by us, Greg, and by other reporters as well, but certainly us as much as anyone at the Center Square have questioned him about ethics. And both he and his lieutenant governor candidate, Christian Mitchell, say, well, we did this. We passed this ethics reform. Things are better now. We see people like Madigan facing the consequences of what they did. But again, good government groups, Reform for Illinois, and especially State House Republicans say it's still too weak, and we still have the same essential power structure, even though Speaker Welch is a different personality than Michael Madigan. Certainly, he holds the same power, and he wields the same power. And, now, if you're not on his good side...
Welch isn't the chair of the Democratic Party. That's one thing that's a little different here, but when it comes to how the House operates, Welch has kept the same rules that Madigan operated with that Velvet Hammer moniker for decades.
Exactly. And that's been one of the chief arguments. The House floor leader, a Republican minority floor leader, Patrick Windhorst, has said this numerous times. He said, we haven't changed the House rules. We need to change these rules. And although, as you said, Welch doesn't have that purse string power where he's able to, if someone's not on board with him, He's going to make sure they're primaried out, that kind of thing. Madigan, that was going out with Michael Madigan long before we saw in some of these national races. But so Welch doesn't have that party purse string necessarily, but he's obviously one of the, after Governor Pritzker, one of the more powerful voices in the Democratic Party and in the legislature, Greg. As you said, if he's not on board with something, well, it's not getting through. The bill's not getting called. And that goes for members of his own caucus as well as Republicans.
That's right. That's right. But, one thing I think is fascinating is what the Madigan trial really revealed, at least for me as a reporter. I'm sure you being in that courtroom during that duration of the trial and seeing the evidence that they were bringing forward from the, emails, plenty of emails going back and forth between various actors in this, the recorded wiretap phone calls that the feds were getting on Madigan and other players in this saga, and even the undercover video recordings that sources were using to give to the feds. I did put together just a couple of moments here from some of that stuff that you saw in the courtroom and that the federal prosecutors provided. It's from 2017, a couple of weeks apart. It's a phone call between Danny Solis talking about, quote, quid pro quo, and then going to visit Madigan at an office weeks later, and Madigan making a point to take him off to the side from a meeting that was happening to demand that he not use those types of words again. Let's watch that clip.
So I'll meet with them next week on Thursday, and then I'm going to set up a meeting with you and them. Good. And I think they I think they understand how this works. The quid pro quo. Okay. So I just want to let you know that I did that, and I'll follow up with you after Thursday. Very good.
Over the phone, you made a comment that there was a quid pro quo.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
You shouldn't be talking like that.
All right.
You're just recommending.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because if they don't get a good result on the real estate taxes, the whole project would be in trouble.
Yeah.
Which is not good for your ward.
Good.
So again, it goes to show that if the federal prosecutors get some kind of inkling that you're a bad actor, you're likely going to be captured on email or phone or even a trusted source that you're having dinner with a little pocket camera in there or something.
It was remarkable, and that certainly brings back memories, Greg, as I think back about that trial. Hearing that there were over 200 hours of recordings. Wow. There were emails and texts, as you mentioned, some of the back and forth involving Chicago politicians, state politicians, utility company executives, etc. And I talked with defense attorney Sam Adams Jr. He represented former Governor Rod Blagojevich. Remember that name? Illinois governor who was convicted of corruption. There were two trials. Adam was on Blagojevich's defense team for the first of those when there was no conviction. It was only the second trial that led to convictions for Blagojevich. And he said, what you just heard is what this case comes down to. Quid pro quo. Was this actual something for something? Or, as the defense team has argued, these were gratuities. These were favors, political favors. This is politics in Illinois and elsewhere. This wasn't actually a getting something in exchange for something. Well, again, the prosecutor in this case, Julia Schwartz, laid out very clearly, certainly that's her line of argument, and the prosecutors, that this was something for something. There was a fraudulent exchange, and it was, she said, quintessential bribery.
Well, again, it's the idea was that Madigan was lining up certain legislation to benefit the utility company, and then in exchange, he would get his foot soldiers do-nothing jobs for a healthy contract with some of these other organizations that he was getting legislation across the finish line for. So you can see where, again, that just corruption conviction would come from, especially with the feds providing all of this evidence. So, of course, we'll be waiting to see what the appeals court does with Madigan's case. But I think something else, too, Jim, that we've got to maybe get an update on or something, or maybe we can have our reporter at the Center Square in Washington, D.C., if they ever get in front of the president again, ask if he's gotten a letter from Mike Madigan requesting a pardon or a commutation or something like that. So that's another story for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. And three members of Congress, the three Republican members of Congress in Illinois, specifically wrote to the president saying, do not consider pardoning this man after what he did to the state of Illinois. Mary Miller, Darren LaHood, and Mike Boss. They said,
but at the same time, though, Jim, the president did commute Blagojevich.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, absolutely. So, and in fact, there was some talk that Madigan's team may reach out to Blagojevich himself to try to put in a word with the president. So, yeah, who knows? This could lead anywhere.
But we also know that Blagojevich and Madigan did not get along at all. Well, again, a lot of palace intrigue there, but again, it's important to point to the accountability that's happening in this particular case. Jim Talamonte from Illinois. Greatly appreciate taking the time. All right, now it's time for America's Talking, with headlines impacting you, the taxpayer, from all across the country. You can find these stories in the description below. You can get the free newsletter at thecentersquare.com. Consumers in Wisconsin can soon place sports bets online after Governor Tony Evers signed a bill Thursday to legalize online sports wagering in the state. The Center Square's John Stife reports Evers will now negotiate compacts with the Wisconsin's 11 tribes to send revenue from gaming from the tribes to the state. Those compacts must be approved by the federal government. Evers framed the bill signing as the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one, and vowed to come up with agreements that benefit all of the state's tribes. The law would allow for similar sports wagering model as Florida, where the state's sports book operators have servers on federally recognized tribal lands, while users can be in the state of Wisconsin. A group of Republican Ohio lawmakers want to significantly restrict sports betting in Ohio, banning all gaming on college sports and bets placed on cell phones. The Center Square contributor David Beasley reports the move to take away options from bettors comes 3 years after the state approved legalized sports wagering, and it collected billions in taxes over that time. But Republican State Representative Reardon McLean thinks it's all too much, and he believes the reality is that most bettors don't win. Other lawmakers think that sports gaming is addictive, damaging to mental health and marriages, and even can contribute to suicides. Now, under the legislation in Ohio, sports betting would only be allowed in casinos and not on cell phones. In Pennsylvania, lawmakers there appear to agree the state's $7.25 an hour minimum wage is outdated, but details on how far and how fast to raise it are up for debate as a House-passed bill heads to the Pennsylvania Senate. The Center Square contributor Lauren Jessup reports Democrats say it's time to do the right thing, while Republicans claim the bill fails to protect the wages of tipped workers, so they suggest finding some middle ground. Supporters cite the fact that Pennsylvania's minimum wage not increased since 2009 when it adopted the federal rate increase. They say it'll put more money in people's pockets and reduce the struggles to attract workers who are leaving for neighboring states, with minimum hourly rates ranging from $15 to $17 an hour. Critics warn the increase could raise prices in Pennsylvania, reduce hours or jobs, and hit lower wage parts of the state harder. In Arizona, Senate Republicans challenging a resolution Pima County passed that restricts federal law enforcement from conducting operations in the county. The Center Square contributor Zachary Schmidt reports Republicans filed that complaint this week with the Attorney General's office in an effort to stop that Pima County resolution, saying that the resolution, quote, limits and restricts ICE's ability to comply with the congressional mandate to inspect, investigate, arrest, detain, and remove aliens who are suspected of being or found to be unlawfully present in the United States. Now, months ago in Pima County, the board there of supervisors, they approved that resolution that prevents federal law enforcement from using county-owned properties without permission for civil immigration enforcement activities. And that's just some of what America's talking about with the Center Square. Again, find those stories in the description below and get the newsletter in your inbox at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and you can join us back here Monday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.